Not a third time, and we are live. Greetings and salutations, most beautiful beings, and welcome. Also, apologies for the double bois. Somebody forgot to check a little checkbox. That person may have been me. Well, it only seems appropriate to go extra and to go sensational because today, of course, we are talking about pulp fiction. No, not that pulp fiction. We are not going full Tarantino. We are discussing, of course, the pulp genre. Well, we'll talk more about that later, really what pulp is, where it came from, and how we can celebrate the great and basically kind of reinvent the problematic, I think is what we're discussing today. But certainly not problematic is my very fine set of guests that I bring you today, Trip Galey and Chris McCartney. Guys, how are you doing today?
Fab, thank you. How are you?
Oh, absolutely great. Apart from the small double bois experience, as I say, just seems very appropriate for pulp. How about you, Chris? How are you?
I mean, that was the pulpiest intro imagining. I'm just, yeah. So yeah, do it twice. So no, I'm feeling
Do it
great now.
twice.
I'm feeling pumped actually after that.
There we are. That's how we do. That is the World Anvil way, bringing people up and getting them pumped. So Trip Galey is a writer, a doctor of the academic persuasion, and a researcher of all things pursuant to bargains, exchanges, and compacts of a fairy nature. It is inadvisable to attempt to make a deal with him. You have been warned, although questions later are acceptable. He is 1/3 of the queer small press Boner Books, half of the Underhill Academy of Science Fiction and Fantasy writers, worth a check out, by the way. I've met the other half as well. Excellent team. And 100% geek. And I'm sure he won't mind me revealing since we are among friends. He's also a tabletop nerd, as well as a writing nerd. Has credits both as a published novelist and an RPG writer, I believe. Isn't that correct, Trip?
That is correct, yes.
You see, do I not bring you the best nerds, best flavored nerds? Frequently writes as a ghost, mostly harmless. And of course, I have Chris C.L. McCartney, is a writer of fantasy and, to his recent surprise, queer cosmic horror. I can only imagine those tentacles. His latest short story, Red Flags, can be read in the forthcoming anthology, The Crawling Moon. He is co-founder of, surprise, surprise, Boner Books, The Awesome Beans, and co-editing the LGBTQIA plus pulp anthology, I Want That Twink Obliterated, which we will be talking more about later. In civilian life, he is, and I must pronounce this very carefully, a professional poly wonk and is trying to diversify his wardrobe colours beyond black. We welcome all flavours of goth nerds here, Chris. You are among friends. Welcome. And you guys are both in London, correct?
Correct.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
we're in the London writer flat.
Yep, same flat, different room.
So they live together, they publish books together, they also write together. Trip and Chris. I had the absolute pleasure of meeting them both a few weeks ago on a not quite a writing retreat, not quite a writing self-flagration, something in the middle. There was cake. But yeah, I absolutely had to have them come and talk about pulp. Because they have this fantastic pulp anthology coming out. I did allude to it in their bio. Can you tell us, just before we get started on the pulp topic, can you tell us just a soupçon about the anthology that you guys have coming out?
I'm going to cede this one to Chris.
Oh, okay, right. Trip's normally the pitch guy. Right, fine. So basically, it's a ridiculous queer extravaganza of like every single trope that we want it to be this, of every single trope that we've sort of adored but always found like slightly problematic, like reinvented and exploded through a queer lens. So we're kind of, give us your femboy starship captains, give us your trans berserkers filled with queer rage. It's been such a joy just to see people reacting to the idea of this anthology, and because of how these anthologies work, like we're giving a vibe. We're saying like, right, we want these pulpy, exciting, turned up to 11 stories, and we want them queer as humanly possible. And now we just get to wait and see what the authors that we've brought on board do, and see what the open submissions have in store for us.
And we'll be talking about all of that later. I am so excited about this. I could not be more excited. And I'm going to tell you why, because pulp is awesome. And that's really the topic of our discussion today. Pulp is awesome, but how can we extricate it from some of its problems and make it even more awesome, which is what I feel you guys have done so beautifully. So usually when I kick off with one of these genre talks, one of these unpacking talks, I start with a definition of the genre. But with pulp, which is kind of like a super genre, more like a style, I feel like we need to start with origins. Trip, can you tell me a little bit about where pulp started?
So the term pulp comes quite literally from the material that the stories were printed on. They were printed on wood pulp paper. In the early 1900s, there was a huge, massive explosion of demand for stories. They needed a lot of stories quickly. They needed them cheaply produced. They needed them in the hands of people. You mentioned the dime novels, the penny dreadfuls.
Yeah.
Pulp is a continuation of that inheritance. That's where the name comes from. Stories on cheap wood pulp paper, and that's sort of where it begins. Certainly not where it ends, but that's
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, they were descended already from this what was considered cheap entertainment. These like 19th century dime novels, they're called in the US, penny dreadfuls, they're called in the UK. Not to be confused with the excellent Penny Dreadful series, by the way, but inspired by the same thing. And then on the other side of the writing space, there were these high quality magazines called Slicks. And they were called Slicks because they were published on this really sleek, beautiful, high quality paper. And they were very expensive because, of course, they were very high quality. Um, and the first pulp magazine creator uh, advertised his stories of $1 worth of stories for 10 cents. And his theory was they want the stories, they don't care about the quality of the paper. So what they really want is they want the entertainment. And it was considered cheap paper, cheap writers, we'll get into that, and arguably cheap entertainment, but it absolutely took off. Chris, I want to talk with you a little bit about the kind of genres that come underneath this pulp style. What for you are some of the real iconic genres within the pulp sort of umbrella?
Well, as you've sort of alluded to, that the fascinating thing about it is that it's a story like vehicle mode more than it is a genre. So like anything could be pulp as long as there was an audience to sell it to. So you have romance pulp magazines, you've got westerns, you've got science fiction, you've got horror, particularly kind of these sort of both sort of occult horror and cosmological horror became like really huge during this period. Like this is the Lovecraft era. Sort of space opera kind of evolves under pulp. It's like that science fiction in a way kind of codifies into this thing. Uh, yeah, like, and my personal huge love is detective fiction. I'm a massive hard boiled detective fiction nerd. Whether that's like Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, classic detective nerds, or your kind of your occult detectives, your John Constantines, your Harry Dresdens. That's my happy place.
Amazing. And yeah, you're absolutely spot on. Like it was the birth of genre fiction in this very real way. Like what we do, we are indebted to pulp, can I just say? It popularized fantasy and science fiction and horror. These are all the elements of the RPGs and the not and the speculative fiction, right? Novels that we're, you know, experiencing today, that we're still seeing hit the big numbers, the big blockbusters. And of course the descendant of all of that was to be comic books, which are a direct descendant of pulp as well. So all the way through you see this line of, you know, what people considered cheap entertainment, sensationalized entertainment, which really is our bread and butter today as world builders, as creators, and of course has become a lot more sophisticated and has become, you know, a lot more nuanced, which we're going to talk about later. um just as a kind of like example in the space, because I feel like examples are very useful when we're talking about when we're talking about a genre to help people orient themselves. What would you say are some like really your favorite or the famous examples of pulp magazine writers and pulp characters? Chris, do you have any favorites? You mentioned the hard-boiled detective, particularly.
Oh, I mean, I have to go Raymond Chandler here, even though I'm aware that I'm editing a science fiction, fantasy, and horror anthology, but I've sort of kind of neglected to stick detective fiction in there. Like, I probably should have found a way to just write me some science fiction detectives, please. But yeah, there's something about just, I guess, the efficiency of pulp. You know, like these people were paid by the word, but the stories were also pretty short. It was this fast-paced, give me the crack hit version of writing story. And yet somehow Raymond Chandler seems to combine that with like vibes for days. Like his ability to like evoke mood is just phenomenal. And he just has these like, I'm very into like efficiently great sentences, and he will just have these similes that just like punch you in the face. I was looking at one earlier, and what was it? I thought he was as crazy as a pair of waltzing mice.
Are they crazy? Are they not just in love? I'm not the target demographic for that book. I can tell you that. Like, now I want to know about the mice. Do you know what I mean? But yeah, absolutely. Powder, do you have any favorites or like particularly famous examples of writers or
Fritz
characters?
Leiber. Fritz
Yeah?
Leiber, Sword and Sorcery. I'm a fantasy guy. Like, give me magic, give me drama, give me sparkle. So I love the over the top fantasy. Fritz Leiber's great. He wrote a story called The Bazaar of the Bizarre, which actually is about a magic shop rather than a bazaar, but it's part of my doctoral research. I will not go too far down into that, but that trope so inspired me that I did an entire doctoral degree on it, and my debut novel is built around the idea of a bazaar of the bizarre, or as I prefer to term it, a goblin market. So, Market of Dreams and Destiny out now from all good bookshops and some evil ones.
There you are. Which I still have not read yet, to my shame, but it's on my list. Yeah, as Secondhand Samurai says, Grey Mouser, Fafford and the Grey Mouser, absolutely like cornerstone of the genre. I mean, if we want to talk about sword and sorcery, Conan the Barbarian, the ultimate pulp hero, Robert E. Howard, just like absolutely formation of a genre right there for me with Conan the Barbarian. He screamed onto the page and everyone went, "What is this sword and sorcery?" And Robert E. Howard said, "Yes." That's how it looked in my head anyway.
Also, like, really distinctively pulp, I think.
Yeah.
Conan, like, because it has both, your heroic male archetype barbarian hero smashing his way through hordes, but also you have this kind of cosmological horror element that feels like, yeah, these people were rubbing up with like the H.P. Lovecraft crew, and like it's sort of, you have all these sort of subgenres within pulp, but they're all kind of, a lot of them are reading each other and they're talking to each other. I talk about Raymond Chandler too much, but he has a story called The King in Yellow, which is a reference back to Robert Chambers' sort of classic horror, again, like slightly cosmological horror or weird horror story collection, The King in Yellow. So they're all kind of cross-pollinating in a really interesting way. Sorry,
Yeah.
No,
No,
Well,
absolutely.
and
You can tell that these writers were all reading each other. Go ahead, Powder.
yeah, and also like pulp is sort of one of the foundations and foundries of fandom as well. Like, the reason this cross pollination was happening was the pulp magazines accepted letters from readers and from other writers, and people would write in about the things they loved, the things they didn't, and it would spark discussions. Brian Atterbury, a science fiction academic, describes science fiction and fantasy and horror as parabolas, because unlike some other genres which have very strict formats, science fiction, fantasy, and horror, like pulp, are almost more modes of storytelling than formal genres. And it's because you get this ongoing discussion. You can change things, you can respond. The very first generation ship story was a certain kind of idea. But then later on, you would get other kinds of generation ship stories critiquing the science or critiquing the human experience of being stuck in a can in space for 400 years. All of these things, the science fiction and fantasy fandom itself, it is a dialogue. It is a loving, sometimes very fractious, just interplay of thoughts, ideas, words, and just stuff, because we love stuff, right?
Which is also why you kind of periodically get these litfic authors who, they're brilliantly talented. They write amazing books. And then they're like, I'm going to write a genre novel. And they just like smash into that wall head first, because every single like fantasy fan or science fiction fan reads the book and is like, you're not in the conversation. You haven't read this book, this book, this book, and this book, and you don't understand what's already been said. And so you've fallen into this trap and that trap, and you've done this really stupid thing.
Yeah, absolutely, because, you know, there are conventions to these genres. So just a few more. Arthur C. Clarke was originally a pulp magazine writer. When I mentioned before, cheap paper, cheap writers, and cheap entertainment, pulp magazines paid their writers really badly. What this means is that a lot of authors got their first writing creds in pulp magazines because nobody else wanted to write for them because they paid really badly. So what you see is a lot of debut works from a lot of who went on to be very persistent and famous authors like Arthur C. Clarke and Asimov and Lovecraft, who cut their teeth in pulp. And I think that makes a huge impact on their words, on their sort of subsequent works as well. Oh, Zorro was another one for me where I was like, what? Zorro was a pulp? And then I was like, yes, of course he was. Of course. But until I had read it, I never made that connection. And I think a lot of these very big heroes, a lot of these very big sort of iconic things, John Carter, somebody mentioned in the chat as well, first been in pulp magazines. They're iconic because they're from this space and they've just kind of like entered into our kind of like collective zeitgeist consciousness almost. Now we have touched, and this is really one of the big meaty topics, I think. We have touched on tropes. What are the great tropes from the pulp fiction genre? What are the tropes that you feel are defining, the tropes that you love to see, that you really, really enjoy? Powder, why don't you kick us off?
I don't know if this precisely counts as sort of what you're talking about, but the twist, like just the idea of the twist and the twist ending is so central to pulp storytelling. I love a story with a twist. I love a story with multiple twists. Something unexpected. Yeah, you've given me like a specific trope thing. I'm like, I don't know, but like twists, definitely. Yeah. Like the Lester Dent method, since we're talking about pulp and pulp writers and famous pulp writers. If you are a writer out there and you want to try your hand at pulp, there's this thing called the Lester Dent method that you can look up, and it is how to write a 6,000 word pulp story. And he breaks it down in 4 1,500 word chunks. He tells you exactly what to include, when, where, why, and how. And of course, at the end of each 1,500 word chunk, there is a twist. It is foundational to the genre, and I love it.
Amazing. I think I'm gonna gazump Chris and throw in, for me, the foundational one. Everything over the top. Everything must be dialed up all the way. Forget 11, 20. Everything is so over the top. Heroes, villains, actions, drama, scenography. Everything is like so melodramatic in, for me, one of the most enjoyable ways possible. in general. And for me, that's one of the great tropes of pulp. Like, you are never in doubt what somebody thinks or feels. You are never in doubt where you are or what kind of fun you are having. That is delivered to you in a sort of high octane, super concentrated form right at the beginning. You're on the sleigh ride. You go all the way through all of the fun, all of the like genre and setting, pow, 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 all the way through. So I think for me, that is one of the most like defining parts of the genre, that sensationalist, that like super injection, I think, for me. How about you, Chris? Do you have favorite tropes?
Oh, I'm going to be greedy and have two. I think,
Go.
firstly, I assume this is like somewhere on TV tropes, but I don't know what it's actually called. But like the hero who's holding himself together through pure willpower. The like you get it in fantasy and science fiction. You get it in like detective fiction. Like they've been beaten down. They're being mind controlled by a monster from beyond the dark dimensions. They're crawling up a mountain to drop a ring and stuff. Sorry, no, no. And like they should be dead. They're battered. They're bruised. They should be giving up, and they're still just through pure force of obstinacy. They keep going, and there is a line in the film, the classic noir film, The Big Sleep, which epitomizes this for me, where like towards the end, like one of the hero's been like captured. I think he's like tied up, about to be killed, you know, and the femme fatale goes, "Why did you have to go on?" And he says, "Too many people told me to stop." And it's just so ridiculous. But it's like, yes, no, you cannot stop me. I am the protagonist.
I am stubborn and I have plot armor. Yeah, I mean that kind of like the roll a will check. It's such a, for me, that's like iconic of Daredevil, and of course it's iconic of so many of like the superhero, but it's iconic of so many of these other characters as well, where that, as you say, there's literally no reason they should be surviving at this point. They've been blown up 7 times and perforated by uranium, and still they go on through sheer will. And honestly, I kind of love that. I think you're right. I think that's a really wonderful trope to have.
They could do it all day.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that. This is again one of my favorite things. It doesn't take itself too seriously as a genre. This is not. It's not po-faced. You're not made to think deeply, and they are fun. They are escapism. They are light. They're often a little bit racy. Like, they're never prudish. They're very light, fun fiction, and that makes them very accessible as well, I think. And that's something I've always really enjoyed about like pulp as a genre. Do you guys have another one? I could do this all day.
I think the other one I went to immediately was like the Eldritch horror, because like there are certain stories that I imprinted on really, really just like ideas, kernels of ideas that, like, even if the story was probably fine, like they made use of something. And I have this distinct recollection of reading, I think the book's called Thomas by Robin Jarvis, which is like kids fantasy where like all the protagonists are anthropomorphic animals. That kind of thing. I read so much of those. But basically, over the course of the plot, like there are like sort of sanctuaries and special things that have to be protected, and one of them's been taken, and blah, blah, blah. And basically, over the course of this children's novel, and it is a children's novel, it emerges that the thing that's being protected in the various sanctuaries, and that must be like protected at all costs, is like the shattered egg of some kind of ancient alien monster from another dimension that must be protected at all costs. Otherwise, they will reassemble the egg and they will call down the monster, and a demon god will be brought. And I just remember being like, 13 and reading this, and just being like, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen.
Amazing. And I mean, that goes back to Trip's point about twists before, right? Like, there should be a twist. The twist should be wild. I think like
more is more.
Yeah, exactly. More is more. Maximalism, absolutely. I think for me, the covers as well.
Yes.
Trip, you need to talk about this, I can see.
Like there's this is a thread in pulp if it's not an actual trope, and it is like that thread of surrealism, sort of the unknowable, like the unspeakable horror from beyond the dark of the stars. That is, it's a specific trope, but it's also partaking of this idea of surrealism, and just like extraness, and like the covers. Some of the covers that you get in pulp are just these fantastic images that make no sense, but at the same time fit. I love that. I love the racy covers. Chris actually at one point bought me a copy of is it Astounding magazine, and it's a naked man, like almost like flying into space, so you can see his bum right there, but he's like surrounded by stars, and I'm like, I am going to frame this because it is like a work of sci-fi queer art. I love it, and I'm like not to go all crazy about like the anthology that's coming out, but the artwork, the pulp genius of the artist that we found just mirrors that era so well. And it's racy, it's fun, it's extra.
And we had so much fun doing it as well, like emailing the it was actually incredibly pulp. So we, found this artist who does like pastiche artwork of a certain period, and we're like, right, this is exactly what we want. And so we're having a bit of a discussion, and we kind of went, well, right, so we feel like we probably there needs to be a twink. It's on, I want that twink obliterated. There needs to be a twink about to be obliterated on the cover. Right, that's non-negotiable. Could we have a dragon? Dragon's good. We could have a dragon in there. Could you know how like film posters in like the 60s and 70s, you'd get that kind of big villain at the back sort of thing, looming head of Darth
Very
Vader,
Ming the Merciless.
Exactly. Can we have like a looming villain? And we just sort of went through this laundry list of all these cool things that we thought would be great. And we're like, he's going to give us like 4 of these. This is ridiculous. There's no way. It's only a book cover. You only have so much space. He's only... Okay, well, any 4 of these would be fun. We'll see what he comes up with. And then Stephen sent us these rough sketches, and he had somehow crammed every single idea that we sent to him into one image.
I would like to say that is the epitome of pulp. If you were wondering what pulp is, oh sweet audience, that is the epitome of pulp. You take loads of really cool ideas and you ram them into a thing, and then you turn up the color. And that's the other thing I love about the covers, is everything is so brightly colored, and I think that's very true in the writing as well. Like everything is vivid Technicolor,
Yeah, sorry, just jump on again in with another thing that I absolutely love about pulp fiction and the pulp era is, granted, it began before we had the huge commodification of genres that we have today, but pulp fiction's willingness to just ignore genre boundaries, to transgress countries of ideas, and like take different jigsaw puzzle pieces and just mash them together into one glorious chaotic whole. Like, yes, like science fantasy. It's my happy place. Like that. So just the mixing and the sheer inventiveness that you get from that.
Yeah, that genre blend. It's really enjoyable to see, and they didn't see this as boundaries; they saw it as opportunities, which is really cool. Okay, so we've talked a lot about why we love pulp, and folks in the chat have been sharing that as well. Guys, keep telling me why you love pulp, because do you know what? This should be a big old celebration of what we love. Now we need to talk about the other side of pulp. Pulp is of a different era. We've discussed this. It grew up from the 19th century. It was mainstream. I don't want to say lowest common denominator, but like mainstream popularity writing in the first half of the 20th century. So it has a lot of the problems of its day inherent within it. And I think that it is important to talk about these things because otherwise it's very easy to read a story that is pulp and go, oh my God, this was great. I want to write something like this, and accidentally carry all the problems over into your own writing, which we don't have to do because we're smart and enlightened humans. So, yeah, I think this is particularly appropriate because you guys are, of course, in reinventing this genre like through a queer lens. What for you are some of the most problematic tropes and issues with pulp fantasy and science fiction magazines?
I might jump in with like the really easy one and just sort of go for it's the default white male protagonist, who's young to middle aged and like probably a scientist if it's sci-fi. Probably he's intelligent, but then also sporty, so that he can do the athletic fighting things as well. Because it's the sort of it is in a way like it's the fundamental problem of pulp that there was an overwhelmingly white straight male audience, but also those were the people who edited the magazines. And they had a certain view of what sort of science fiction should be like. And, so you had editors like John W. Campbell who like famously, rejected an excellent Samuel R. Delany story on the grounds that the protagonist was black. And he was like, my readers will not be able to empathize with a black man.
Yeah.
And so it's the sort of the foundational thing that just kind of like has its tentacles into all of pulp. I feel you kind of the way it responds to women a lot of the time is because it's got this very sort of the period male gaze, and so yeah, it's so much of pulp is like very protagonist focused. It's like they're the person and they're proceeding through a really fast, exciting story, meeting all these character archetypes. And that's part of the thing, is that pulp is so like quick. It needs to be like, bam, character has entered the scene and you know exactly who they are immediately. So yeah, of course writers are reaching for archetype. They're reaching for really clear ways to like communicate who this character is instantly. So you have the damsel in distress, you have the femme fatale, you have these things because they're right there in the toolbox. And for me anyway, I realize I probably just like reached out and kind of touched lots and lots of tropes that maybe other people wanted to talk about. But it also feels like it kind of comes from that like original limitation which pulp placed on itself.
Yeah, Chris inappropriately touching tropes here. That's absolutely fine. Don't you apologize. Paolo, what for you stands out as like one of the big ones?
I mean, he's gone around and he's licked so many of the big ones. I don't know if there are any left.
This is obscene. Twitch will take it down. No, we're fine.
Yeah, just to echo that, it is. You know what? I'm just going to slightly, pick up a thread and expand on it. Pulp was fast-paced, both narratively and in terms of the turnover that they needed. The stories are quick, so people are using archetypes, and they drew on really unfortunate racial and regional stereotypes as well. It's bad, but unfortunately it's effective. Given the audience that you had at the time, people were familiar with those tropes. They were familiar with that sort of presentation of that person, so it saved time on the page. And I think that keys in for me one of the big problems of pulp fiction is that it can foster lazy portrayals. It can foster lazy storytelling. It can foster a sense of this is the way things are, so we just go with it, rather than interrogate things, because interrogating things takes time, it takes thought, it takes investment, and
word count, which they didn't have as well.
does take a lot of word count. Yeah. So that is a big foundational problem that is still that we're still seeing today, honestly, because we are still dealing with media forms that bear a lot of or have a lot inherited from pulp fiction and pulp genres. But like, no to racism, no to sexism, no to the patriarchy, no to heteronormativity. Like, you can do a lot in a few sentences. You're not going to kill your word count. You just have to work a little bit harder.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I would flag that Chris also touched on is the lack of characterization and nuance outside the main character, which becomes really problematic because then everything outside the hero is a straw man, which means you never have time to give anybody else real thoughts or feelings. And if you have also chosen to have a straight white male protagonist, literally everyone who is not the straight white man is a straw man. And that's an issue with the genre that is hard, but I think it's possible to overcome. Like, you can present different types, you can present different opinions. There is space for dialogue in pulp, and I feel like this is something that is absolutely, like, we're able to fix this as writers. Maybe there'll be slightly much less gratuitous stabbing, but do you know what? One of my other things on my list is so much murder, because I've literally written, it becomes hard to make anything meaningful when mooks are dying left, right, and center. Do you know what I mean? Like, if your go-to is death, it's quite hard to get further than that. Like, you've already gone to 11. And I think that there is space, even in pulp, I feel like there is space for, something between a conversation and death, that might enable people to...
You can have the conversation. You can have the witty repartee while you are stabbing people to death. Like, we can totally do that.
Pulp as well. One of the other ones. Sorry, Chris, go ahead.
No. Well, I was just thinking that sort of reminded me of one of the other projects I have going on with Trip, because we are unable to go 5 minutes without inventing a project, is a novella that's set in a sort of radically genre-mashy, queer-inclusive, gender-inclusive world. And we've done some pulp writing in that space. And what I think kind of cool and really fun is that pulp inherently is often very suspicious of the other. The tropes are often like, black people are a strange race from a dark continent, and like, either you're an adventurous archaeologist who's going to one of those places to explore and go down into a temple that wasn't like somebody's place of worship. Oh no, it's a creepy thing filled with like traps, and or like there's a strange cult of suspicious dark people, or people who don't conform to gender stereotypes or sexual expectations, sexual mores. Like they're suspicious, they're weird, they're probably a villain. That you really get that in hard-boiled detective fiction. Like, not conforming to gender stereotypes is a real red flag.
Oh yeah, and any woman with power will be evil by Act 3, or like that's the twist. If a woman has power, the twist is that they're evil because they didn't conform to gender stereotypes.
Yeah. And just writing what is like functionally a pulp story in a world that is like radically inclusive and empathetic, just kind of guts all of that almost immediately, and it's a really lovely, liberating thing, and it kind of lets me keep all of the bits of pulp that I really, really enjoy without having to like be, oh god, what have I done?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny that you touched. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Trip.
I was just going to add on, like, and it being so queer and so queer friendly, like, we're talking about pulp as being like cranked to 20. Drag queens, they're cranked to 20. Like, it's it just fits.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Going back to problematic tropes, colonialism was one of the ones I flagged, particularly because of things like jungle operas. Um, fun story, I tried to read The Lost World by Arthur Conan Doyle because I love dinosaurs and I like Sherlock Holmes. And oh my goodness, I could not get through it because of all the sexism and particularly the racism, the kind of like, we are in a wild world with the like a wild land of wild peoples like this. The white savior, absolutely an issue with these kinds of travel stories, especially. Big old pulp problem, something that is a problem especially for like fantasy travel stories or sci-fi travel stories as well. Yeah, just waving the flag for that. Just be aware because it's something that's still very much in the tropes that are still used, and it's something that's directly from these kind of pulp stories. Like, yeah, there's an entitledness to the explorer that needs to be questioned when we're telling these stories, I think.
Yeah, especially because so much of it, like being a huge tabletop geek, so much of it is in our favorite tabletop games. You see like assumptions about race. You see temples that are just a bunch of traps or referred to as like a dungeon when it's really should be a much more nuanced sort of,
Yeah.
well, that's not actually how the world really works. Like, yes, we want our adventure fun, but we should be aware that we can have adventure fun without drawing on all of these problematic and harmful tropes. And they are. A lot of them are inherited from pulp. Like Gary Gygax,
Yeah, absolutely.
Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser show up in a lot of early D&D manuals and things.
Yeah, absolutely. And just on you mentioned Ming the Merciless. In my reading, I discovered the term which I was not familiar with, the yellow peril, which just makes me instantly go as a concept. I will share with you in the chat the
You are
TV
so
tropes
lucky to have
on that.
avoided that all this time.
Yeah, I was not aware. General kind of xenophobic 19th century stereotypes where you bring in the other only to be like the mystical villain. So just a kind of heads up that is a thing that we don't need to do anymore because we are more sophisticated than that now, and isn't that awesome? Basically, like, have great villains. Do not make them the token Chinese person, please. We don't need to do that. We can be more awesome. Good. Okay. Well, we've talked a lot about what's awesome about pulp. We've talked a lot about what is potentially problematic about pulp. So how can we overturn these kinds of problematic tropes, and we've touched on this a little bit already, to make pulp acceptable for modern audiences? Chris, I know that you touched on this, so why don't you go first?
Sorry, I preempted. I mean, I suppose it depends a little bit in how you're approaching it. I'm always a very researchy kind of a writer. So if I'm going, oh, I really fancy writing a hardboiled detective story, I will go and read a load. And that's sort of how I approach it. And so I think for me, it's a matter of understanding where the harm comes from, where the problematic stuff is coming from. So this is again tying back to what we were sort of discussing before, that the issue is that yes, the perspective of the protagonist is often extremely dominant. It's so fast paced, you normally get very, very cursory introductions to characters and things like that. And so it's a matter of going through the narrative being like, okay, so I'm reaching for this trope in the box because it's going to be quicker. It's going to be quicker for me to introduce this character. Like, where does that trope come from? What does the perspective of my protagonist on it do to that trope? And it's about sort of situating yourself in the story and just thinking it through. That's probably not terribly helpful.
No, I
It's
think
complicated.
humanizing it absolutely is one of the first steps. Like, what if I looked at this today? What would I think? Is absolutely like you can trust your judgment to a certain extent as well, I think. So I think that's very, very astute. How about you, Trip? What are your thoughts on that?
So I'm actually putting together a video course on writing pulp fiction or writing pulp fiction in the modern era. So I've been thinking about this quite a lot, and like from a writer perspective, like tropes and a lot of the pulp aesthetics that we've been talking about, these are tools in your toolbox. Some of them are wrenches, some of them are chainsaws. You need to know how to use a tool before you employ it, or you're going to cut down a tree on your own head and you might hurt someone else in the process. So completely echoing what Chris said, yeah, be aware of what these things are and where they're from and the effects they have, and doing that sort of like work to understand the tropes and how they work also in like the fiction, because we have a lot of examples that we can look at. You can go on TV tropes and you can get whole lists to try and explore. Read it, see how it works, write it for yourself in a small test project maybe, or even a larger project, and yeah, see how it works and then use it safely, because you can subvert so many things, and it is possible to take something and subvert it or twist it or invert it and still maintain the, yes, you will 100%, you will lose more than a day to TV tropes. I lost years. I got a doctorate out of it, but I lost years to TV tropes. But yeah, you a lot of the time you can paint the wrench glitter pink and it will still do the nuts and bolts jobs. Yeah. So be aware of what you're doing. Remember that subversion is your friend. And when crafting a pulp story, pulp as a feeling is a gestalt. You can make something feel pulp if you achieve a certain level of it. You do not have to use all of the same things. It's about enough elements to working together will produce the feeling. You are almost certainly going to be able to create a modern, sensitive, engaging, amazing, fun to read pulp story without having to fall back on some of the tropes that are more difficult or even downright impossible to use, because some things are unsalvageable. But yeah, it's a gestalt. Find other pulp tropes, put them together. You can still have your pulp story. You do not need to use the double-ended chainsaw that is going to cut everyone to ribbons.
Right. I love that as an analogy. So we've talked about the pros and cons of pulp. What inspired you guys to use it as the subject for your anthology?
Well, the weird thing about the anthology, and indeed about our imprint, is that it was literally that would be a good title for an anthology moment. And we went very, very rapidly from, that could be an anthology. We could do that anthology. Everyone here in this room have the necessary skills to make that happen. We're doing an anthology, aren't we? It was like literally about 10 minutes.
So it really came from the title, by the way, is in reference to a meme from 2019. I want that twig obliterated. Very, very big in the queer community. So it came from the title. The title became the vision, and the vision led you to pulp. I mean, the title is "I want that twink obliterated." I can see why pulp was the space.
Pretty much. It was just, again, it was yeah, like 15 minutes worth of spitballing almost. And we were like, okay, well, what would that anthology be? Well, obviously, it would be an anthology of ridiculous, over-the-top stories that play around with who's yelling, "I want that twink obliterated"? Is it our hero who's got like a literal demon twink that's chasing after his soul, or is it the villain who's got a heroic twink destroying all of his plans? And it was just like, who's sitting there going, we've not seen those stories. We've not, it's always the heroic, traditionally masculine soldier man. who's who's storming the alien base. It's always your brawny barbarian who's slashing his way through the dungeon, and it's like, well, what would these stories look like if you had a non-traditionally masked guy in that role? And indeed, what would these stories look like if you had a queer sensibility running through it? Because one of the things I always find interesting is that thematically, queer stories are often quite different. They have different concerns in the same way that, like, your first half of the century straight white male is going to have certain conceptions about what being masculine is, about like what family is, how important it is, how important your job is, and all these sorts of things. Queer stories are often very different. You grew up often in a society that is either now or has a point been hostile to you. The history of your rights are like a history of a thing that have been like fought for. An awful lot of science fiction and fantasy is concerned with the status quo, like the return of a king, restoring a system that's been disrupted by an external event, and that's often like not, that's not a concern that necessarily resonates with queer people. Like we might want to break down the system because the system's wrong. Aspiring to join the guard of the city. Guard of the city is possibly somebody who was being very prejudiced to you. So it's what I think like immediately grabbed us on like the sort of serious level once we'd sort of stopped giggling at how awesome the title was like, oh, actually, those stories could be really radically different. And if we make a Kickstarter, we can pay people properly, like pro rates, we can pay queer creators to make those stories happen. And so within about half an hour, we were just like, yeah, we're definitely doing this. Like, we have to.
Amazing. Okay, so that is an incredible origin story. What kind of genres of stories are we expecting? Because as we've discussed, pulp is not so much of a genre as it is kind of an attitude. So, or a gestalt, as Trip said. So, what kind of stories should we expect?
Science fiction, fantasy, and horror. The classic big three of the geeky genres that we all love. Because as much as we would like to be pulpy and shove everything in there, we need a little bit of a theme, just a little one, because otherwise our job is going to be so hard. And it's already going to be really, really difficult. We have got some like really good stuff. We've already got I think we got exactly 42, which actually makes me quite happy right now. 42 submissions already. So yeah, science fiction, fantasy, and horror, all of those things that, are part of the pulp inheritance, but like should really be more concerned with how the other is treated and like the possibilities like inherent in these stories. Like science fiction, fantasy, horror, all of these things challenge the very laws of reality under which we operate or live day to day. They should be by rights on the side of the minorities, on the side of people looking for possibility rather than reinforcing what we already have. So that's what we're looking for, is those sorts of fantastical genres, science fiction, fantasy, and horror, and the possibility that they rightly owe to disadvantaged people across creation. And soapbox.
As I said, the reason these guys are here is because I think this is an amazing project. I think the world needs more queer fiction. I think the world needs more responsible pulp fiction, and I think that this is going to be pulp for good, pulp for people. That's kind of what I'm here for. But what you guys are here for, of course, is to ask questions from my expert guests. So let's do a couple of those. How do you suggest aspiring pulp writers read the older, more problematic stuff? Asks ECC Books. There's stuff to learn there, but from student writers, I will say ECC Books is a writing professor in the States, so at a university. So just to add a little bit of context. From student writers, I found are hesitant to read stuff that has big problems in it, even when there are learning opportunities there. What are your thoughts? One professor to another, Trip.
Obviously, this is sort of like a complicated issue because universities funding how much you can access. There's obviously modern inheritors of pulp that approach things much more sensitively, and those kinds of things may be more palatable to your potential students. Otherwise, some things that I have done in class is zero in, like really focus on a particular passage that would be more accessible or would be easier for students who have these sorts of concerns to approach and engage with.
So excerpting, essentially.
Excerpting, modern inheritors of pulp. There have been a couple of really, really good modern science fiction and fantasy pieces that engage directly with problems in H.P. Lovecraft, for example. Obviously, the title is just going to fly out of my brain right now. I won't be able to think of it. But yeah, pulp isn't dead. Pulp isn't stuck in a museum. Look for those pieces. Try excerpting older ones, or another thought is there are, as we know, a lot of classical stories that people are used to. Tarzan. People are used to the idea of Tarzan. Tarzan is pulp. Isaac Asimov has a certain reputation. He got his start in pulp. I believe even Ursula Le Guin has some stories that were first published in pulp magazines. So you do have authors with very reassuring credentials. Perhaps they might have some stories that you can find and use as course material.
Stay away from The Lost World by Arthur Conan Doyle. It's unreadable. It's unreadable, guys. I was so sad. Another great question from my chat. Is pulp style something you'd recommend to new writers because it has so much within easy reach and expectations in the toolbox to get that first manuscript finished?
I think probably yes. But it's also one of those ones where there are also then a load of pits that have maybe sort of enlarge and there are larger trip hazards maybe. Yeah, because like particularly if you're like writing your first thing, finishing things is the most useful thing you can do, and is so hard.
Yeah,
and with pulp, with like these genres and subgenres that effectively elevate and celebrate formula and tropes, there's this fantastically exciting, fun, action-packed toolkit you can reach for to like power you through to the end of your story, and that's a great thing. But it does mean, if you kind of get a Lego kit and you put the bricks together in a way that makes it, it's a kit for a house, and you're like, oh, I'll build a house, and you will quite possibly end up with a house that looks very, very similar to the house that everyone else has built.
Yes.
So I think, yeah, like reach for the tools. They're great. But there's probably more of an onus to think about, like, what's the unique thing that you're bringing to it as a writer? What's your Trip loves the term novum. What's your the unique perspective that like you're adding that's gonna like make this feel fresh again to a new generation of readers?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say I'm actually going to echo Joella K and say if you love pulp, if you love reading pulp, if you like high octane drama, then write pulp. That's what I would say. Is write something that you can stand and know that you won't do the best job the first time, but you're gonna finish something. I think finishing something is always the first goal. So if that's pulp, great. And like Chris says, like there's a lot of things that can help you on your journey because of the formulaic nature of it. Absolutely. One more time, I just have to share this spectacular art. I want that trink obliterated. Let me show you. Has already absolutely blown through its goals. Look at this nonsense, guys. You've done so great. Congratulations. It has 5 days to go, and I happen to know that there is a one-page RPG that is exclusive to Kickstarter that you will not be able to find if you do not get it at Kickstarter. And I would just say that these are some amazing writers, and this is an amazing project. And if you are into short stories, if you are into pulp, if you think this looks interesting, I would always encourage you to back if you can. And if you cannot back, but you still want to support, go share it on social media. Go share it with somebody that you think would love it. This would also be a great gift for the pulp lover in your life as well. So, there are lots and lots of ways to support if you feel you do not have the funds to back. But I will say, I'm gonna be backing this one. I'm very excited. I think I want this in the world, and I think that's what Kickstarter should be about. And I think that's where I want to leave this today. Folks, thank you so very much for joining me today on this parabola through pulp. It's been an absolute pleasure. Any closing words about pulp advice, writing pulp advice?
Have fun. Like, the genre is about having fun. You have a fantastic toolkit. You have a huge amount of source material. You have a lot of stuff you can rip apart and rewrite and make better. But for me, have fun. Like, have fun with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris, how about you? Final thoughts on writing pulp for our beans.
Don't let annoying people on YouTube tell you that tropes are bad. Tropes are great. Use tropes.
Absolutely, I would 100% agree with that. I'm going to echo Trip and say also have fun, and if in doubt, do more. Dial it up to 11. That's what pulp is all about. Just do something ridiculous. You can always take it down a peg later. Go crazy. Enjoy. I think that leads us to the end of this. We will be going on a raid, and our raid shout is Light Up the Forge. So shout it out when we get to, I would say Strix's line, to let her know that we sent you. And have a beautiful time zone wherever it is that you are. Good luck with Spooktober. I happen to know we have a write-in tomorrow, same time that the stream started. So if you're still trying to get to that 13 spooky prompt total so you can get that badge, maybe tomorrow is your day. Join Madeline on the live stream, and I'm sure it's going to be super productive and you're going to get some stuff done. In the meantime, of course, you know what my final recommendation is. Grab your hammer and go world build. Bye, everyone!